Well, amazing. Okay, thanks everybody for joining us, and thank you so much to Carlos for joining us tonight. Carlos, this is our China is Not Our Enemy book club, and we started last fall. And your book, The East is Still Red, was the first book that we've read together. So for people who have been here since then, have been here since the beginning, and have read your entire book, and we've talked about it, and we're just really very excited to hear from you. So Carlos is gonna give us a little introduction to the book and his process, why he wrote it, and then we're gonna head into some questions, and everybody can have a chance to ask Carlos some questions about the book. So welcome, Carlos. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you very much, everyone, for inviting me and for coming along today. Excuse if I'm like a little bit all over the place. It's pretty late here. I'm literally wearing my pajamas, brushed my teeth already. So this is the last thing I'll be doing before retiring. Is it all right if I just kind of speak for a few minutes, just do like a few minutes of monologue about why I wrote the book, just extended exercise in self-justification, and then, we can move into ask me anything type territory.
Right.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, the book came out in 2023, and I guess the process of writing it was a couple of years. Um, like a lot of books have been written about China. Why write another one? If you look on the Amazon bestsellers list on global politics, there's plenty in relation to China. For example, Overreach, how China derailed its peaceful rise, Hidden Hand, exposing how the Chinese Communist Party is reshaping the world, Every Breath You Take, China's New Tyranny, Stealth War, how China took over while America's elite slept. So, there's any number of books that aim to prove to you that China's this terrible, authoritarian, dystopian, aggressive, repressive, reactionary country that's intent on, taking over the world, subverting our democracy, and denying freedom to its people. So obviously, I wanted to write a slightly different book, a book that covers China's achievements, a book that presents, a positive and, in my view, realistic view of China's foreign policy and its kind of whole multipolar strategy, and something about the successes of Chinese socialism, and which I have to say is a much less crowded marketplace than the China bad bookshelf. So there's kind of two key motivations, which overlap to some degree. The first is about challenging the war propaganda. The US and its allies, as you very well know, are pursuing a new Cold War against China. And as part of that, there's a vicious propaganda war being waged. And, I think probably people recognize on this call that that the new Cold War is likely to step up. Probably people recognize that in as much as the Trump regime is extricating the US from this kind of quagmire in Ukraine, the motivation for doing that isn't that there's some kind of peace-loving, long-haired hippies who just want to bring back the spirit of Woodstock, drop some acid and make love, not war. It's about a strategic reorientation towards China and fighting a Cold War on one front instead of two. So I think we can expect this campaign of encirclement and containment to escalate, and the propaganda war along with that. What have we been told about China for the last few years? That it's carrying out a genocide against Uyghur people in Xinjiang, that it's suppressing religious and linguistic freedoms, that it's engaged in predatory policies in trade and investment relations with the global south, that it's setting debt traps, it's preparing for war over Taiwan. The Chinese are stealing our jobs, they're stealing our technology, and in summary, they hate our freedom. And, this is a point I make quite often, but it's really important to understand that this propaganda war is a form of war propaganda. You've got a US ruling class that's dead set on maintaining its hegemony, maintaining its dominance, holding on to its economic advantages, maintaining the whole system of unequal trade and unequal exchange, and pursuing essentially a project for a new American century. Um, and yeah, okay, on the one hand, a Cold War is better than a hot war, but um, Cold Wars are not always that cold. The original Cold War wasn't terribly cold if you were in Korea or if you're in Vietnam or if you're in Indonesia or if you're in Brazil or Nicaragua or Chile or Guatemala, Um, the Cold War was pretty hot and took the lives of many, many millions of people. Um, and aside from that, in addition to the Cold War aspects, in addition to the economic attacks, the trade war, the tariffs, the sanctions, um, and the diplomatic attacks, there's also a deepening campaign of military encirclement. That's the meaning of AUKUS, which CODEPINK has been campaigning very effectively against. That's the meaning of the provision of direct aid to Taiwan. That's the meaning of, this expanding array of military bases in the region. That's the meaning of placing nuclear-enabled warplanes in Japan, in South Korea, in Okinawa, in Guam. That's the meaning of reviving the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, encouraging Japanese rearmament. None of this has got peaceful purposes, and it's clear that there's an influential faction in Washington that sees ultimately outright war with China as the only viable means of containing China and stopping it from overtaking the US economically and technologically. Um, so, this propaganda war is about enrolling public opinion for the new Cold War and potentially a hot war against China. So that's one of the two key motivations for writing a book is to counter this propaganda and to try and explain the reality of what China is doing, especially the positive things that it's doing in terms of its diplomatic approach to international relations, its opposition to war, its promotion of peaceful dialogue, um, its leading role in preventing climate breakdown, the role that it plays in managing pandemics, and so on and so forth. And the other key motivation for writing the book was more kind of directly leftist oriented and Marxist. It's around explaining Chinese socialism and countering this idea, which is pretty hegemonic, including on the left, I would say, in the West, that because China's got, carried out market reforms over the course of 4.5 decades, that it's gone capitalist. I mean, apart from anything else, it really makes very little sense to me that people on the left would want to A, deny China's achievements, or B, ascribe them to capitalism. China's lifted 800, 900 million people out of poverty. That's been recognized by the UN as the most extensive and successful poverty alleviation program in history. Um, so, yeah, as people have pointed out before, while the US and its allies have been waging wars around the world, China has waged war on poverty. Why would we want to ascribe that to Chinese capitalism? And do people even think that it would be possible if China were just a regular capitalist country? If the capitalist class, this relatively small group of people that own and deploy capital, dominated political power, would they really allow the country's resources to be directed so consistently and comprehensively towards solving the problems of the poorest members of society? And the same with what China's doing around environmental issues. China's emerged as the runaway global leader in renewable energy. I mean, it's not even close, right? China's responsible for about 60% of all renewable energy production and investment globally. If in as much as there's a renewable energy superpower in the world, it's China and it's only China. It's also a global leader in biodiversity protection, in electric transport, like 98% of the world's electric buses are manufactured in China, in afforestation, in pollution reduction. If you look at what's happened in the West in relation to climate change, this is something that we've known about for a very long time, for more than 3 decades, right? It's been internationally recognized, and the problem of climate change and the basic outlines of the solution have been written down in international law. But we've made so little progress since then. In many ways, the problem's got a lot worse. And the reason is capitalism, because we've left it to the market to solve this crisis. We've worked on the basis that the profit motive and the dynamics of supply and demand are just going to magically make the problem go away, and they haven't. Meanwhile, it's China that's making real progress. Why is it China that's got more renewable energy capacity than all of the G7 countries combined? Um, why is it in China that the forest coverage has increased, has doubled from 12% in the 1980s to 24% now? Um, why does China lead the world in the production of electric cars, trains, and buses? You know, do people really think this would be possible if China were a capitalist country, if the capitalist class was in control? And if it is, then why hasn't that happened elsewhere in other countries in the world? So, what I posit in the book is that China's been able to achieve these things precisely because it's a country where political power resides, is located in the masses of ordinary people rather than a wealthy elite, as it would be under capitalism. People get confused about Chinese socialism, and it's kind of understandable that people get confused about Chinese socialism. It's not actually a simple phenomenon because of China's level of engagement with the global capitalist system, because of its market reforms, and the fact that there is a huge volume of private capital in China, there is massive inequality. There are billionaires, for God's sake. There's Starbucks, there's KFC, there's McDonald's. So I think a lot of people on the left who are, involved in radical movements, when they think about what they're fighting for, the type of socialism they want to see in their countries, it almost certainly doesn't involve KFC. I mean, I can relate to that. I would absolutely love to place KFC and etc. in the dustbin of history. So, there's any number of contradictions, there's any number of problems. Um, but ultimately, there are these market-based measures and reforms that were introduced in order to stimulate development such that the country could advance and people could live better. And we have to say ultimately that that's been a very successful experiment, because even though there is tremendous inequality, basically everybody lives an awful lot better than they did. And everyone has those essential guarantees of food, shelter, clothing, clean water, modern energy, education, and healthcare. And, I'm in London. You guys are in, I think, predominantly the US. I wouldn't have to walk very far outside my front door to find people who didn't enjoy those basic human rights. And I suspect that's also the case for nearly all, if not all of you guys. So, you know, that's like the other central motivation for me in writing the book. And obviously I go into a fair amount of detail in trying to explain the reality and the historical trajectory of Chinese socialism. So yeah, that's my intro.
Thank you so much, Carlos. It's so amazing to hear from you. We have a lot of people here. I think probably a lot of questions. Maybe I'll start it off with one though. Um, I'm specifically interested in, you had this whole chapter that you wrote about China's poverty alleviation, taking about almost nearly 900 million people out of extreme poverty. And I'm interested specifically in the concept of common prosperity as the goal of China's government and as the goal of a political system in general. But for people who, maybe joined our club recently or are new to the topic, can you briefly explain what that is? And have you seen moves or policies in the past few years that have been implemented to take China from where it is now, having eradicated extreme poverty, into a future of common prosperity?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. That's an interesting question that we could probably go into quite a lot of depth on and talk about a lot. Um, I mean, common prosperity has been a goal of the Communist Party of China literally since the start. Um, um, it's this notion of establishing some level of prosperity, and the Chinese like to use the expression moderate prosperity to kind of make it clear that they're not going for affluence. They're not trying to make everyone wild rich. But they're trying to achieve a society in which everyone crosses a certain threshold of moderate prosperity such that they can, do meaningful work, have their essential material needs met, and have sufficient leisure and free time that they can pursue their interests and, achieve some level of, self-actualization. They're kind of moving gradually up the Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? Um, and if you look at the speeches of all the Chinese leaders, of each generation of Chinese leaders, basically the Mao Zedong generation, the Deng Xiaoping generation, the Jiang Zemin generation, the Hu Jintao generation, um, and the Xi Jinping generation, all of those leaders will have talked about common prosperity. Um, and Deng Xiaoping used the phrase repeatedly, actually, when he was introducing the reform and opening up. He said, we're going to let some people and some areas get rich first, with the aim of them having taken the lead, helping out the other areas. Um, but the aim is not to create a capitalist system. The aim is not to create massive inequality. The aim is always to create common prosperity and to raise the living standards of everyone. I think particularly since 2020, 2021, with the achievement of that first centenary goal of eradicating extreme poverty, such that literally every single person in the country of 1.4 billion people has got those guarantees met of adequate food, adequate housing, adequate clothing, um, clean clean water, improved water piped into your home, modern energy, electricity and or gas piped into your home, and guaranteed minimum 10 years free universal education and basic medical insurance. Um, they set this centenary goal, which was for by 2021, by the centenary of the founding of the CPC, which was 1921. Um, we will ensure that we've met this goal of eliminating permanently extreme poverty, um, which they've achieved. And since that, then common prosperity has become much more prominent as a slogan. And what it really represents is kind of moving on from dealing with extreme poverty to fixing relative poverty. So ensuring that people don't slip back into extreme poverty. And also, you've got a new baseline now, which is like not extremely poor, but really quite poor. So shifting that up and then preventing like really extreme imbalance. So trying to reduce the levels of inequality, trying to ensure that, the nascent capitalist class, like the group of people that do own and deploy capital, especially in new industries like the tech industries, things that aren't necessarily very closely connected to the state, that don't necessarily um, operate under the direct guidance of the Communist Party, that aren't state-owned enterprises, et cetera, et cetera. Like the state doesn't have to worry about steel companies, it doesn't have to worry about transport companies, it doesn't have to worry about the big banks because it owns them, it runs them, and they're publicly accountable organizations. Um, Whereas especially tech companies and like private education companies were developing huge quantities of capital. Um, and part of this whole common prosperity program is about making sure that that capital doesn't turn into political influence, um, and that it's properly regulated, and that all these new industries serve the overall needs of the Chinese people and feed into the overall development plan of what is essentially still a planned economy. Um, so in terms of actions that have been taken under this banner of common prosperity, one of the really positive things has been unionization of the gig economy. So you've got lots of people that, people like the equivalent of Uber drivers or delivery drivers, et cetera, et cetera. This is uh, a burgeoning kind of casualized labor pool in China, which probably includes up to maybe 100 million people. So under this framework of common prosperity, they've ensured that the labor laws are updated to mandate that all people working in casual labor and on 0 hours type of contracts have full labor rights and have union representation. and have the right to collective bargaining and so on. There's been like a level of crackdown on certain tech companies. Alibaba, for example, was prevented from going to IPO um, because it would have meant like uh, basically moving outside of the government, too far outside of the government's regulation. There have been some crackdowns on like they've essentially banned all these private tutoring companies that were making a fortune out of a very competitive education system. So people were using their financial resources to ensure that their children could get into the best high schools, into the best universities. Um, so yeah, there's been like this raft of policies that have been introduced, but the headline is trying to reduce inflation and trying to prevent what Xi Jinping refers to as the uncontrolled expansion of capital.
Incredible. Thank you so much. And to everyone who would like to ask a question, you just put your hand up and I will call on you guys in order. So I think our next question was Kim.
Okay, Carlos, I don't know whether you can help me with this, but I have always been impressed with China's consistent stance in the conflict in West Asia. So I'm really very puzzled. In 2011, when China abstained in the resolution 1973 that allowed NATO to attack Libya. I mean, it is because of the UNSC during the United Nations Security Council voting. Both Russia and China abstained, and that allowed the US and NATO to destroy Libya. So, can you explain to me what you think is the rationale behind this? Because I'm kind of bothered by this. Thank you.
No easy questions tonight, huh? Um, yeah, look, I mean, I think everyone can agree that it was like not China's finest hour diplomatically. Um, so there's a few elements to this. Um, First is that China basically went along with the advice of the Arab League, um, and the Arab League was in favor of abstaining on the resolution, um, and China went along with that, rightly or wrongly. Um, but China obviously has to balance its international relations with different countries. West Asia in general and North Africa is extremely important part of China's development strategy. And even where you've got deeply reactionary countries or deeply reactionary governments, for example, in Saudi Arabia or in Qatar or in Jordan or in the UAE or whatever, China has relations with these countries and has increasingly very important economic relations with them. So I think there was an element at which it didn't want to go against um, their advice. Um, the second aspect is that China at that point still did not have a record of using its veto in the UN Security Council. The number of times that China had used its veto at the UNSC was like it was a small handful. Um, it was still very much in a international relations zone of Deng Xiaoping's slogan of "We'll hide our strength and bide our time." So essentially, going along with the the US-led international order and just building up its internal strength. And in the last 10 years, especially, and particularly since Xi Jinping became General Secretary of the CPC, it's started playing a much more active role and started asserting its own interests and those of the global South in general at a level of international law, at the UN General Assembly, at the UN Security Council, and in other international forums. Um, so it would like for China to actually use its veto then would have been a quite big thing. It would have been probably a bolder statement than it really wanted to make, especially in relation to a country which wasn't actually, Libya wasn't a particularly close ally of China, not to get too far into the realpolitik of it, But if that had been about a no-fly zone over the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, then it probably would have exercised its veto. But it seems like it took a judgment call not to do so. And the last thing to mention is, of course, that the text of the no-fly zone resolution, um, like it was, you don't have to read very far between the lines to understand that, okay, this is about waging a war of regime change against Libya. It means shooting down its planes essentially, and supporting a proxy force, and a regime change operation that's backed by the CIA. Um, However, the text of the actual resolution doesn't say we go to war. The text of the resolution says we prevent the Libyan Air Force from perpetrating a massacre in Benghazi and wherever else. So in terms of the spirit of the resolution, um, it's not quite as bad as China essentially voted for war on Libya. Um, but I do think they learned from that experience, as did Russia, and China and Russia both in a parallel situation just a few months later did veto a similar resolution in relation to Syria.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you to Kim for that question. Next we had Michael Snellfiekma.
Yeah, Carlos, I just want to say that I really loved your book. It was extremely helpful. And I think that I'm just trying to think of things that are especially difficult to explain to American audiences. And one of them, I think, is, you know, you made the statement that you believe that political power is held by the masses of the people in China. And I think that the question that would come up to most Americans is, if that's true, how does that work? And that kind of leads into understanding what the Chinese call whole process democracy and so on. How would you, if that question were posed to you, which I'm kind of posing it to you, how would you answer that? How would you respond?
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because like the specific version of kind of parliamentary Westminster style democracy, essentially capitalist bourgeois democracy, um, that we experience to whatever degree in places like Britain, in places like the US, has become so normalized in our narrative that we just put an equal sign between that
Mhm.
and democracy itself. So, as in terms of what people understand from their education and from the media, it's that there is this type of democracy, and in this type of democracy, everyone has a choice. You can vote for the Democrats or you can vote for the Republicans. And if the Republicans are in power and they do stuff that you don't like, then next time vote for the Democrats. And if the Democrats are in power and you don't like what they're doing, then next time you vote for the Republicans. And isn't it great? You know, we are the people, and we're asserting our will through our vote. And you know, that's the beautiful dream that completely obscures the reality that we live in a capitalist dictatorship where both Republicans and Democrats and both over here, the Labour Party and Conservative Party pursue fundamentally the same agenda. You know, they represent some slight tactical and strategical differences within support for maintenance and expansion of US imperialism around the world, and the maintenance and expansion of corporate profits, you know, of finance capital, of the military industrial complex, of big pharma, you know, that's what all the political parties, all the main political parties, the ones that can realistically get into the White House, get into the State Department, get into the Pentagon, that's what they represent. And it's the same here, and it's the same across Western Europe and across North America and Australasia. That's how modern capitalist democracy works. So I think, you know, if you say, well, does China have that system? No, it doesn't. You know, China has its own, as you said, our whole process, people's democracy, they call it, which is, you know, it's not particularly something that you'll read in a book by Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels. It's something that's developed over the course of time and through the reality of China's revolution and its process of building socialism. And it's changed a lot over the time, and it's responded to changes in society. But I I would posit, it's funny, first time I went to China was in 2019, and I was speaking with someone from the Chinese Academy of Marxism, and her way to explain the differences between Chinese democracy and American democracy was that, well, look, your president is Donald Trump. What has Donald Trump ever done for anyone? In China, Donald Trump couldn't be a village prefect, never mind president of the country. To be president of, to be in the standing committee of the Politburo, or to be, you know, the governor of a big Chinese province. I mean, Chinese provinces are huge, right? They're like, if you're talking about somewhere like Guangdong, it's 130 million people. You have to have a record of literally decades of selflessly working in the interests of the people. You have to be able to prove, your CV has to say you have improved the lives of tens of millions of people. That's how their democratic system works, right? Chinese, I would say, on average, are much more politically active than Americans or British people are. People are much more likely to be involved in their people's committees. Obviously, the National People's Committee is basically like the government, their equivalent of the parliament. But those committees also organize at a provincial level, a regional level, a city level, and a village level. And they're active in workplaces and trade unions as well. So, and they have like the level of difference and the level of kind of vibrancy of political debate within those organizations, within those kind of local government bodies and national government bodies, is way more dynamic and way wider than the differences between the Democrats and the Republicans. You know, so yeah, there is a big attempt to improve grassroots democracy, to expand participation, to get people more involved in governing their lives. But there's also a fundamental aspect that the country is run in the interest of the mass of the people. The capitalist class, that small handful of people, isn't allowed to dominate political power. So you've broken that link, you've broken that correlation that runs so deep in our societies between money and political power. And Eric Lee puts it quite well in that John Pilger film, The Coming War in China, which many of you probably seen, where he says, the difference between the US and China in terms of their democracy. In the US, a handful of billionaires tells tells the cabinet what to do. In China, yeah, we have some billionaires, but they don't tell the government what to do. The Politburo tells them what to do. So the power dynamic is the reverse, and capitalists are not allowed to organize as a class in China. It would be illegal for a group of capitalists, a group of people who own capital, to organize their own political party that was based around their specific political interest. So in that sense, they continue to call it people's democratic dictatorship, which is based on the alliance of the working class, the peasantry, the intelligentsia, and what they call the national bourgeoisie, so the anti-imperialist, the non-comprador elements of the capitalist class, which is led by the workers and peasants. So, as I say, it's a very different form of democracy to the one that people are used to, but it's in my view, legitimate and I think significantly more effective and significantly more representative than the one we experience.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Great question, Michael. Thank you so much. I'm sending it over now to John Marienthal.
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting.
You're
You've
on.
muted yourself again.
John, you're on.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Sorry. Well, I basically was a teacher in China from 1998 to 2004. And I have some disagreements with something about what you said on education. But I wanted to speak mainly around the issue of democracy, because while it's true that there is direct uh, consultative democracy in China, democracy on a local level is a wholly different situation. Um, Normally, delegates to the National People's Congress or the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is their main advisory body, are nominated from the level below. So a delegate in, say, Ningxia, who there'll be a meeting in Ningxia, and the delegates from Ningxia will elect someone to go up to the Ningxia province level. Then someone from the Ningxia province level will be elected to go up to the National People's Congress. So it isn't as if people are voting across the country to elect leadership. And in the case of Beijing, for example, the districts in Beijing are part of the Beijing local People's Congress. But if you're in an everyday situation in a city, um, the people in cities don't elect their leaders. They don't elect the mayor. Um, so there are levels of democracy in China, but at the very lowest level, there's really very little democracy, and it's something that the Chinese are certainly aware of. That they're working to improve and find different forms for. But we can't just say that Chinese is quantitatively the democracy in China is quantitatively better than the democracy in the United States. We have a flawed political system here, but there's some things where we've had 200 years of developing democracy that experience applies to China as well.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, John. I think that is a very fair challenge, and I certainly wouldn't want to give the impression that I think Chinese democracy is uh, like the pinnacle of socialist democracy. Clearly, it's a work in progress. Clearly, there's a lot of improvements that are there to be made. But as you say, I think that is something that's pretty well understood by the Chinese leadership. They are experimenting with different forms of grassroots democracy. Actually, when I was on a delegation a couple of years ago, we went to a kind of experimental new village of a population of about 10,000 people, which was kind of rolling out new forms of collective decision making and local democracy. And this was being performed in parallel in a few different provinces, with the idea that, well, we'll see how the results are, and if they're successful, then we'll see about rolling it out more widely. So there's definitely a long way to go. But I think the trajectory is towards greater and greater democracy, greater and greater participation, greater and greater choice, which frankly is the opposite trajectory to what we're experiencing in Western capitalist democracies.
Thank you, Carlos. To Michael Madden.
Hello, thank you, Megan. Thank you, CODEPINK. Thank you, Carlos, for your ongoing intention and purpose to make known the truth of things. I was particularly struck, and I would like you to expand, as you know, and this has to do with China's approach to the COVID pandemic. I heard a report that, and I'm asking you to share with us so we could demystify. People say, well, really capitalist controlled China. So what I heard, Carlos, was they sent mobile teams. There was a nurse and there was some of the mobile CAT scan. They went to every door, took a temperature. If you have a temperature, we're taking a CAT scan. If the CAT scan reveals that you have compromised lungs, then you're going to a regional hospital. So to me, we can never do that in the United States, is say, listen, we value your life so much, we want to get you and the rest of the world out of harm's way. So just, and whatever you could share with us, which shows their approach to how they value the life of their citizens, as opposed to the rich and the powerful valuing the life of their prophets. Back to you, Carlos. Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. I mean, COVID, not so long ago that we were all talking a lot about COVID, but at the same time, it feels like a very long time ago. I kind of thought a lot about it and wrote a lot about it, and a lot of the useful things that I knew about it have kind of dropped out of my mind in the intervening period. I actually wrote an article that when I find it, I'll drop it in the chat, called Karl Marx in Wuhan, how how Chinese socialism is defeating COVID-19. I mean, what's I think the headline is that their approach was, whereas the approach in Britain certainly, and I think in the US as well, was basically we're going to do as little as possible. We are going to shut down as little of the economy as possible. We're going to focus everything on making sure that profits continue to roll in. We're going to privilege the interests of capital. China very clearly, very explicitly, and very quickly privilege the interests of human life. They recognized the threat. I mean, nobody knew in early 2020 what the virulence of coronavirus, of COVID-19 was going to be, but and thankfully it wasn't as serious as it could be, although it was still terrible. And I still know people are suffering. There's millions of people around the world still suffering with long COVID and all the rest of it. So I certainly don't mean to minimize it, but a pandemic that even 10% more virulent could have been, could have changed the face of the planet forever. So, China very, very quickly out of the after the outbreak in Wuhan in early January 2020, introduced a lockdown, because the only way, if you haven't got a vaccine, if you haven't got a cure, then there is only one way to prevent the spread of a viral epidemic, and it's to reduce contagion, right? And you can only do that through testing and through contact tracing, and where people test positive is to isolate them and to introduce social distancing. So I think a lockdown was imposed in Hubei, which is the province where Wuhan is, towards the end of January, at which time there are a few hundred cases. Tens of millions of people were required to stay indoors. Schools were closed, workplaces were closed. As much as was possible to go online went online. So school continued, but basically online. Work went online where it was possible. Where it wasn't possible, people were paid, sick benefit, and there was an awful lot of basic support that was organized through Communist Party branches. So people, like nearly everyone in China, lives in apartment blocks, and each apartment block would have a group of CPC members who lived there, and they really took the lead in making sure that, okay, we've got these people who are elder and who are not able to leave, and they're not able to organize grocery deliveries, etc., etc. So we're going to make sure that they've got food sorted out. We've got these people that are immunocompromised. We've got these people who need to go to the hospital every day for dialysis or whatever. All of those things are all of those people's basic needs, which in some places, like in London, there was some kind of pretty informal mutual support group, basically, very well-meaning, but ended up not being very well organized and not very effective. That was taken care of from the beginning in China. And they pulled out all the stops and did everything within their power to make sure that where people had COVID, they were treated, like multiple hospitals were built, like brand new hospitals, were built within the space of a few days, like by the military. What does the US military do that's useful for the people? The Chinese military builds hospitals when there's a viral epidemic. Um, and yeah, aside from that, the there were many thousand, I think 30, 40,000 doctors and nurses um, that volunteered to go to Wuhan, go to Hubei, and to participate in the medical challenges there. There were like 40 or 50 hospitals that were designated as like COVID-19 treatment centers. And the result of all of this, like what seemed to the world like very heavy-handed tactics for dealing with the virus, meant that within 8 to 10 weeks, there was no more virus in Wuhan. And it didn't like there were a few more much smaller outbreaks in other parts of the country, but most of the country didn't experience lockdown in the end. In Britain, in London, I experienced several months of lockdown over three different periods in 2020 and 2021. My kids were not able to go to school for several months. Most places in China didn't experience a single lockdown because the virus had been effectively contained. And obviously, the end result of it was that the death rate in China was exceptionally low, among the lowest in the world. Furthermore, China was one of the first to develop a vaccine. The vaccine was put into the public domain. It was considered to be a global common good. Over 2.5 billion doses of the vaccine were distributed to countries around the world, particularly prioritizing the global south. And I'll tell you a pretty funny anecdote that I heard from the Venezuelan ambassador to Britain. He had been the Venezuelan ambassador to China at the time of the COVID outbreak. And his job in Beijing, his assignment from Caracas, was to organize Chinese vaccines to Venezuela. And he said, it was, the Chinese were ready to provide several million vaccines, but because it had a small element of Canadian intellectual property, they weren't allowed to sell them. Otherwise, they'd be violating North American sanctions on Venezuela. So they had to arrange basically for the Chinese Red Cross to make a donation of several million vaccines to the Venezuelan Red Cross. The only problem there being that the Venezuelan Red Cross is controlled by the opposition, by the anti-Chavistas. So they also had to organize a bribe from the Chinese Red Cross to the Venezuelan Red Cross, such that once they get these several million vaccine doses, they actually pass them on to the government so that they can be distributed to the people. But that was successful, and China did donate, I think, 7 or 8 million doses of their vaccine to Venezuela, which is very significant for a country of, I think, about 20 million people. Yeah, sorry, I've been rambling on slightly incoherently, but I'll send you the article.
Thank you. Appreciate the source. All right, so we're coming down towards 7, and I don't want to keep Carlos too long since it's so late over there. So we might have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So I'll send it to Ethel. Oh, Ethel, you're on mute.
I hit the wrong thing. I'm sorry. After a 10-day trip in China in November with CODEPINK, I have just done a lot of reading, about 4 other books besides yours, and yours is wonderful, and thank you. And this has been mind-boggling, that all of this has been so good. As I did all this reading, I came to the conclusion that one reason China is progressing so well is that China is not the imperialist country that we are. They were hurt by imperialists in the past, but they were victims of imperialism and not imperialists themselves. Well, recently, just a couple of days ago, I discovered a list of China's holdings, a bunch of places, which I don't know where they are. So I had to kind of rethink that. So I'm asking you how you would answer that accusation that China is or was imperialistic, and also tack on that, right now, are you as concerned as I am about the stupid things the U.S. is doing, aggressions against China right now? Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ethel. Interesting and again, complex questions. I mean, the US aggressions against China is the easy part of the question. Yes, I am concerned. I think, yes, we should all be concerned. I imagine it's all going to ramp up. I imagine AUKUS is going to be more active. I imagine the Quad is going to be more active. I imagine there's going to be more provocations in relation to Taiwan, more provision of arms to Taiwanese separatists, and more stoking of that particular fire, which is done very purposefully, very intentionally. And it's all about creating a trigger point, creating a potential casus belli, if that's what US strategists and the US ruling classes decide, that if they decide that what they need is a full-on war with China, which, by the way, would be a war between two nuclear powers, then Taiwan is very likely going to be the trigger point. Taiwan is very likely going to provide the casus belli. And the Trump administration has already made moves softening the US's adherence to the one China policy. And yeah, as I said at the beginning, like the US extricating itself from Ukraine is to a significant degree about focusing its attentions on China. So we all need to be prepared to campaign against this escalating new Cold War, against this escalating campaign of containment and encirclement of China, which is ultimately about defeating the whole multipolar project and projecting US hegemony from the 20th century into the 21st century. It's a fool's mission. It's literally impossible. It can't happen. But the US is, while it may be losing some amount of economic power, while it may be losing some amount of kind of diplomatic and cultural cachet, it is still the only military superpower. It's still the only country with a global military infrastructure with 800 overseas military bases, NATO essentially at its service, nuclear weapons deployments, hundreds of thousands of troops deployed around the world. So the US remains a very dangerous force, and the US potential military confrontation with China remains a very dangerous prospect that we need to guard against. China is, in my view, fairly clearly not an imperialist country. Yes, China engages in the export of capital, which is kind of part of the definition of imperialism. But in a globalized economy, lots of countries engage in the export of capital. There's wealthy people and big companies in Angola that invest in Portugal, but that definitely doesn't mean that Angola is an imperialist country and Portugal is an oppressed country. And foreign direct investment as a proportion of China's GDP is very, very small. It's 2 or 3%. It's kind of on a pretty similar level to Denmark, Ireland, and various Egypt and various countries of the global south. So export of capital isn't the central pillar of the Chinese economy. China certainly is not a beneficiary of the system of unequal exchange. If anything, it's a victim of that system. Chinese labor still produces, a fraction of the value that US labor does, and it's US products, it's iPhones and things of that nature that sell for enormous prices in Beijing and not the other way around. Meanwhile, like, the word imperialism has to include some element of empire, of domination. The word itself means empirism, right? For Spanish speakers, it's a bit more obvious because imperio and imperialismo, it's empire and empirism. That's what imperialism means. And where is China's empire? Where is China's system of political or military or economic domination? It doesn't have one. China doesn't have, unlike the US, it doesn't have a global military infrastructure. It doesn't have 800 military bases. It has one overseas military base, which is in Djibouti, and which is used, to protect shipping lanes off the coast of the Horn of Africa. It doesn't have the equivalent of NATO. It doesn't impose unilateral sanctions. It doesn't impose economic coercion on other countries. It doesn't engage in wars of regime change or campaigns of destabilization or propaganda wars even. So, to me, there is really no comparison, and there's no legitimate basis for saying that China is an imperialist country. Yes, it does have some exported capital, but it doesn't engage in domination of those countries that it exports capital to.
Thank you. Okay, well, we only have a minute left, but I wanted to give Brett the chance to ask his question, so maybe we can ask it and answer it very quickly. Brett.
Yeah, I appreciate that. This could be a question that perhaps could lead us into the future because it's kind of complicated. It has to do with activism and intellectualness. In the late 1990s, the Green architect William McDonough and Deng Xiaoping's daughter Deng Lin had something called the U.S.-China Sustainable Development Forum. And in that forum, they were using the phrase ecological civilization. At the time, William McDonough was talking a lot about building green cities in China. He tends to say a lot of things that don't necessarily happen, but he's a great popularizer. And so I was wondering what proximity people like Xi Jinping and Wang, some of the other members on the Politburo had to some of these conversations around ecological civilization and some of the machinations that were happening in the late 90s and early 2000s, and to the degree that it's how serious of a thing it is today, and how we can become more involved with it and how we can popularize it. It seems like a very soft opportunity to reach out to US and European environmentalists who are very serious, because there's a lack of seriousness in the environmental movement around the global issues in particular. Even Greta Thunberg doesn't, it's my thing, well, I'm waiting for her to go to China and do a little documentary. It's like, what's up? Like, so I know that's a complicated question and perhaps we can come back to it, but it's been such an honor to be here with you this evening. And such a fan of your work.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. Carlos, if you have any final words or any response to that question, and then we can wrap it up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I realize we've run over and the main problem is me yabbering on too much. That's a great question. Let's come back to it. One thing I'll say is that China takes environmental issues extremely seriously. That's really accelerated in the last 10 years or so. As I said before, they're responsible for 60% of all renewable energy production. That's only going to increase. It seems like they've already met their 2030 target of peaking carbon emissions, according to most analysis. That they peaked carbon emissions last year. Very likely they'll also reach their target ahead of time of getting to net zero by 2060. And like what's changed in the last few years, I would say, is that there's been a big information campaign across the country such that Whereas, environmental issues used to be important in top policy circles and would be talked about by the leadership and within the CPC. Now everyone talks about them. And obviously a big part of that was dealing with the pollution issue. And one great thing about reducing air pollution is that you also end up as a byproduct of that, improving the situation with greenhouse gas emissions. But the green ideas, environmentalism, ecological issues are very much part of ordinary people's thinking in China these days. And it's so important that the people who are concerned about the environment, environmentalists in the West in particular, appreciate and understand what's going on in China and get involved with it, because at the end of the day, you're not going to save the world. You're not going to prevent climate catastrophe without working with China. And to me, that's one of the most important motivations for opposing the new Cold War, for opposing this policy and this strategy of confrontation and conflict and decoupling.
Thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you for joining us tonight. I know it's late over there. I think you're in London. It's like probably about midnight. So we really appreciate you joining us tonight. And to have the chance to read your book and to talk to you, which is wonderful. So thank you so much. And to everyone else, our community call is happening now at the email that I sent. So you can go join us over there.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos.